but two dragons of drastically different size and power, different speed and agility, just charging head on, breathing fire at each other and grappling in the sky? What? None of the bog standard medieval fantasy tropes make any sense in a world where a fire-breathing creature larger than a building can appear in the sky, swoop down, and wreak havoc with little to no warning. Knights, castles, even the concept of kings and queens would be swept away in a world with dragons. Yet we see these run-of-the-mill Hollywood fantasy tropes in House of the Dragons. Don't get me wrong, this is a great show. Entertaining, deep, full of interesting lore and vibrant characters. I love House of the Dragons. But did they miss the mark on dragons? Did they really think through just how much this would change the world, change every aspect of human civilization? Let's talk about this. I'll look at dragons from a writing and world-building perspective, discussing what it means to have these magnificent and terrifying creatures living in a fantasy world, and we'll discuss how the dragons in House of the Dragon stack up. Welcome to The Edge, where I explore writing, world building, and how to use AI to enhance your creativity. If that sounds like your thing, you're in the right place. Dragons are fascinating, massive, powerful flying monsters that can breathe fire. House of the Dragons portrays them as intelligent, willful, long-lived, terrifying magical creatures that are feared, treasured, and revered, able to bond with people from certain families who can then ride them and control them. A thing like this changes the fabric of the world. It changes religion, politics, warfare, and a dozen other aspects of human civilization. But the big one, the elephant in the room, has got to be warfare. House of the Dragon Season 2 looks at the inciting incidents and initial phases of a war of succession, a war whose outcome will largely be determined by dragons, by who has them and how they are used. I'll spend most of the video looking at this, how they fight and how they are used in war. And toward the end, I'll talk about other impacts dragons would have on a world and the people who live there. But right now, let's talk about war. It's really the point of the show. You could argue the show is about politics, but war is what happens when politics goes wrong. And in this case, it's gone wrong with dragons. And that's really cool. Thematically, the show equates dragons to weapons of mass destruction. Deterrence the major powers have, but hope never to use. That's a good start. But what they do with dragons barely scrapes the surface of what they could have done. They just didn't dig very deep into the ramifications of dragons, so let's talk about how dragons coulda, woulda, shoulda been used. The way this show depicts the world, it has a very Hollywood-esque medieval European flavor, including how warfare works. Archers shoot bows. Glittering knights in improbably elaborate armor ride horses, which are also improbably armored, into battle against footmen who carry spears, pikes, halberds, and swords. They have chainmail, they have breastplates, all the kind of stuff you'd expect. There are shield walls, charges, siege equipment, boiling oil. Is there boiling oil? I don't specifically remember seeing that, but I'm sure it'll show up. Cities have walls. Stone castles protect strategic points and protect the rulers. The ships make no sense, and frankly, their portrayal is so incredibly bad, I'm embarrassed to talk about them at all. I'll let the history dweebs tell us exactly what period all this is derived from, and I bet they'll complain that it's rife with anachronisms. Heck, I'm not even a history buff, and all the anachronisms bug me. But my point is, all the bog standard medieval fantasy elements are there, and the dragons and dragon riders are the only new thing. But they're the thing that changes everything. None of the typical medieval fantasy tropes make any sense in a world where a fire-breathing creature larger than a building can appear from the sky, swoop down, and wreak havoc with little to no warning. For a world where dragons are real, the way they fight this war doesn't make any sense. But you've got to imagine they've been fighting wars with dragons for centuries. We have to assume they'd have learned a thing or two along the way, and they would have developed some tactics for how to account for the dragons. But we don't see this in the show. And the way dragons fight each other, spectacular. Great cinema, my favorite part of the show, but absolutely ridiculous. In every dragon fight, they've squared off, flown straight at each other, breathed some fire, grappled, and then fallen until either one is dead or they get too close to the ground to let go. What? No one would be stupid enough to just charge in like this. It's dumb. But we'll get to dragon on dragon action later. The fighting kind, not the other kind, you pervs. So, how do dragons change warfare? They can fly, they can breathe fire, and they're huge. What does this mean? First, dragons will be very hard, perhaps even impossible to stop. Second, if one side has dragons and the other side does not, it's not a war, it's an execution. Third, dragons can be used in all sorts of ways to gain advantage and win a war. For example, they can gather intelligence. They can provide both tactical and strategic airstrikes. They can intimidate and demoralize the opposing force. They can cover a lot of territory, essentially fighting multiple fronts at once. They can fight directly in battles. They can protect armies, leaders, and strategic assets from other dragons. Now, you can't see this, but I have an asterisk here next to that one. Given the world's established lore, I don't really think dragons could protect anything from other dragons. And I'll explain that in a bit. It's something they get very, very wrong in the show. Now, we see some of these elements in the show, and I respect that. We see dragons gathering intelligence. It's a good use of them, especially the little ones. They're fast, they can see a long way, and nothing but another dragon can impede their movement. We see them on patrol. We see them carry out strikes. We see them blockading the sea. Or I guess we don't see that. We hear about them blockading the sea. We see them fight each other, but we don't see enough. So let's dig deeper. The most obvious use is for tactical and strategic airstrikes. Dragons can burn supplies. They can burn ports, destroy troop concentrations, knock out cavalry, incinerate siege engines, tear down castles and walls, sink ships, hit population centers, food supplies, water sources, industrial production. All those things that strategic bombers can do now, interestingly enough. And they wouldn't be limited to doing this with fire. They can also drop things from the sky, rocks, barrels of oil, wildfire. They could also support friendly troops by delivering supplies or weapons, though this would be a poor use of them given how few dragons there are. And the real question when it comes to a dragon strike capability is, what are their limitations? How often can they breathe fire? How fast can they fly, and for how long? What is their range? When are they vulnerable? What weapons can hurt them? How long does a dragon need to rest after a fight? I don't know. How often and how much do they need to eat? The series both shows and implies the dragons are used for tactical and airstrikes. It's one part they did pretty well, and the show does address some of the limitations, at least to some degree. Food supply for the dragons takes meat off the table of the small folks. A constant tithe of sheep or pigs is needed to keep dragons fed, and the common folk, they don't like that very much. Dragons need to rest a lot, at least this is implied. They chill in their caves most of the time, and we see Vermithor always out sleeping in the forest when Aemon needs him. And they show some countermeasures, at least in King's Landing. They're building ballistas to mount on the walls, and if an enemy dragon comes down too low, hopefully that'll get them. We don't actually see this, or we haven't seen it yet, but at least they're thinking about it. What about intimidating and demoralizing the opposing force? If you don't have a dragon protecting you, having a building-sized monster swoop down from the sky is truly a shit-your-pants moment. There is literally nothing you can do. It's a weapon of mass destruction. It's a force of nature. Dragons would force entire cities to surrender, force armies on the march to drop their weapons, turn around, and go home. They would break sieges. They would allow the commandeering of supplies. All of this without the need for actual violence. Simply by showing up, a dragon gets these things done. Even if a situation wasn't one-sided, the presence of a dragon would weaken the morale of an army, break their resolve. Suppose you have an army, 50,000 soldiers deploying on the field, and you have your own dragon in the sky. Great. You're still going to shit your pants when you hear that roar and see the other side's dragon coming down at you. You'll be marching into battle knowing a few thousand of you will burn alive in dragon fire. This is going to mess with your head. It's going to make you hesitate. You're going to question why you're there, wonder if this is really your fight, and you're going to ask, is this really worth burning over? And plenty of soldiers are going to nope right out of that situation. Consequences be damned. That makes it hard to keep an army together. It makes it hard to raise an army. They showed this a couple times, and Kristen Cole's story really brings this one home. He gets it. He knows he's an ant next to the dragon riders. Though I was a little surprised at a different scene where Damon threatened that Riverlands guy with a dragon and the Riverlands people defied him, that scene felt improbable. I don't think anyone is so brave or stoic they're going to turn their back on a dragon after the dragon rider said, "You're going to bend the knee or I'm going to burn you alive." That just wouldn't happen. They would bend the knee or he would burn them alive. So they've played with this one. I'll give them that. Good for them. What about speed and mobility? A dragon can cover a lot of territory, essentially fighting in multiple places at once, at least from the perspective of an opposing army. A medieval army on the march moves slower than a person walking, slower than someone taking a hike. It has wagons, supplies, marching soldiers slogging all this gear mile after mile. So for a marching army, 10 miles a day is a maybe. And even that is only for a fresh, well-supplied force marching on a good road in good weather. Any other conditions, they're going to be even slower than that. But a dragon can fly that far in 10 minutes. Now we don't know exactly how fast they fly, but I'm going to assume somewhere between 70 and 100 miles per hour. That's 150 to 220 kilometers per hour for the weirdos out there. No, just joking. I know the metric system is by far the superior system. I don't know why my country doesn't use it. We're not perfect. But these are reasonable speeds for something that big to have aerodynamic stability and for a rider to survive riding them. Much slower, and they're going to fall out of the sky like rocks. Much faster, and the rider is just going to be peeled away like a flake of dandruff. And at that speed, one dragon can cover an area about the size of Normandy in a day. That's about the size of South Carolina for the Americans out there. That means an opposing force will never know where a dragon will be, what direction it will come from, or when it will strike. And a large ground force can neither hide from it nor protect itself from it. Not unless it has its own dragon, Flying Cap. And with this speed and range, a dragon could interdict multiple cities, multiple armies, all in a single day. And potentially, a dragon could fend off other dragons. This is mentioned several times in House of the Dragon, but it feels inconsistent. They rank the dragons by age and by size. And the way this is treated, as well as what we've seen in the dragon battles so far, this tells us that a large dragon will inevitably destroy a smaller one. So that tells us a small dragon could not defend an army. A small dragon could not defend a city or castle, not from a larger dragon, and not from multiple dragons. It would be overmatched and either flee or be eliminated. Now I understand the scaling factor here, but I have a beef with this. And you'll understand why after I discuss dragon versus dragon tactics and explain to you exactly how they would fight a dragon-to-dragon duel. Hint, they wouldn't fight the way they do in the show. That's suicidal and stupid beyond comprehension. But there are ways they would do it, and those tactics kind of eliminate that size advantage. And we'll get to that later. And what about dragons directly participating in the fight? Rather than flying overhead and striking with fire or dropping things, a dragon could directly participate in the battle, using their size and raw power to shred people, tear down buildings, smash ships, and destroy siege equipment. They don't even need to breathe fire to do this. Now we've seen ballista and other weapons that could likely hurt a dragon if it were close enough. So charging in like this would put the dragon at risk. But a skilled rider and or a really big dragon could just stomp, claw, and bite its way through an army or a town and could likely tear down walls and castles without too much risk to itself. So wars would not be fought the way they're shown in the show. It just doesn't make sense. Knights, archers, infantry, marching in long columns, lining up to fight. Armies simply could not function this way, not with dragons in the sky. Imagine an army marching down the road. The show depicted this fairly well, showing the scale and how far along the road the army is spread out. These are narrow roads, typically no more than dirt paths, not modern highways. Roads in Westeros are probably only wide enough for 2 horses side by side, a single wagon or cart, maybe 3 or 4 soldiers marching abreast. A force of 10,000 men will stretch on for mile after mile after mile. Now imagine this army's on the march, and a dragon flies over. One pass along the road, from the head of the column to the tail. The first breath of fire cooks whoever's in the front. Banners, officers, whoever. The next blast cooks a group that look like the leaders, the generals, the nobles, whoever. These people are typically near the front, and their livery and armor make them quite distinct. The next blast cooks some cavalry, men and horses, burning and screaming. And the last blast ignites the supplies in the wagon train. No more food, no more tents, no more tools. At this point, people are burning and screaming. The grass and the forest around them is on fire. Flames are spreading quickly in the dry summer heat. And after that first pass, I guarantee every single person in the entire army drops whatever they're carrying and flees from the road, spreading out, running away, hiding, just praying they don't get burnt next. The army just lost its leaders, lost its ability to signal, lost its cavalry and its supplies, and now it's in total disarray. At best, the survivors will take a day or more to reform and continue their march. At worst, the whole army is routed. Everyone flees and goes home. A fighting force, no more. And even a flyover with no fire would scatter the forces and stop the march. They see the dragon, they're not going to wait to find out what it's going to do. They're going to run away. No one is going to stand there on the road waiting to get cooked. No, armies could not march like this. They would have to spread out, travel in small groups, hide. Now, the show addresses this a little bit. They do talk about hiding in the forest so the dragons can't find them as easily, so they can't be seen from the air. That's good. And I think they also talk about moving in smaller groups. That's also good. And in that last little montage when it shows the big armies on the march, it does show at least one of them has a dragon escorting the army. All of that makes sense. But I still think they don't have enough dragons to cover all the armies on the march, so they'd have to figure out a different way to deploy their troops. Dragons change everything. Take castles. Castles are suddenly a bad idea. Sure, it's a strong point. It protects you against ground attack. It's a symbol of power. But against a dragon, it's just a giant stone pot whose residents have no escape and will be cooked by the first dragon that comes along. Walled cities, same thing. They're just death traps. They don't have fire engines. One dragon strike and half the city is going to burn. We saw Aemond level an entire city. Probably it didn't take much. A few passes, start a dozen fires, then sit back on that hill and watch as the conflagration consumes the entire city. The walls around the cities no longer offer a meaningful defense. A far more decentralized defensive tactic would be needed to stand a chance against someone who's deploying dragons. And such a defense is much less effective at keeping armies at bay on the ground. So I'll give the show a B- on dragon warfare. They show it, the scenes are really cool, and the series factors dragons into how the characters lead and make decisions, but the war depicted in the show is not the kind of war that will be fought in a world with dragons. So what about dragon duels? The dragon fights were the most memorable scenes in the series. Epic, great effects, great sound, interesting camera work. But two dragons of drastically different size and power, different speed and agility, just charging head on, breathing fire at each other and grappling in the sky? What? No. Bad show. Bad director. Bad writers. Don't do that. You really dropped the ball on this. Think about it. Think about what dragons are. Let's make some assumptions here. Big dragons like Vermithor are slow. They turn slow. They have to work really hard to accelerate because they're so freaking big. It's going to take them a long time and a lot of energy to get off the ground and gain altitude. Small dragons are going to be faster, more agile. They can turn fast, they can slow down fast, they can accelerate quickly, and they can climb high quickly without tiring themselves. Let's also assume that dragons are largely resistant to dragon fire. Their scales have got to be fireproof. The fire will cook the rider, but the dragon won't care too much. And the dragons are armored against claws and bites, so it's going to take a lot to hurt them. They evolved to deal with each other, so they're going to be pretty resistant to that kind of thing. And here, the bigger dragons have two advantages. One, they have the raw power to just rip or bite through the armored scales of the smaller dragons, while they're going to have thicker armor. So the smaller dragons are going to have a hard time actually penetrating their scales and defenses. So the big ones can resist the claws and the fangs of the smaller ones. So a lot of that aerial tactics are going to be the little ones doing quick, snappy hit and run attacks on the big ones, or just avoiding them altogether, and the big ones lumbering along trying to find some way to trick the little ones into a position where the big dragon can actually get a hold of them. But it's not going to happen that often. And with these assumptions kind of sorted out, what are the tactics of an actual dragon fight going to be? It's going to be a lot more like World War I and World War II aerial dogfighting. And the big dragons are going to be kind of like the B-17 bombers. The little dragons are going to be kind of like the Spitfires or the Messer... I don't know World War II fighter names, the German ones that went after the bombers, whatever they were called. Anyway, it's going to be all about position, surprise, and maintaining speed and energy while keeping your rider away from the fire and your dragon's soft belly away from the other dragon's claws and teeth. It's not going to be a head-on-head duel like two knights jousting. It's not going to be like that. And a dragon's not just going to fight another dragon one-on-one unless it's really in a pinch. They're going to plan ahead. They're going to have spies and scouts figuring out where the other dragons are. And when they go dragon on dragon, it's going to be 2-1 or 3-1, trying to catch the other side's dragons alone and unprotected. Second, they're going to start the battle high, and they're going to try to stay high, especially the smaller ones. They'll dive in, breathe fire, maybe rake at the wings or the rider with their claws, and then zip straight back up to an altitude where the larger dragon can't catch them. And the larger dragons are probably also going to start at high altitude when they can, because they just can't get up and down that easily. So they start up high, they're going to have a lot more speed and maneuvering ability than if they start out down close to the ground. And they'll also look for opportunities to surprise each other. If one squadron sees another one first, they're going to maneuver so they can come at it out of the sun or out of the clouds, come in from behind to avoid being spotted by the other side until it's too late. And when dragon riders see other dragons in an area, they're probably going to either fall back, because unless they're already in an advantageous position, they're going to lose or put themselves at great risk, or they're at least going to start climbing up to get high above the ground and have that advantage of altitude. And smaller dragons might harass and bother the larger ones, but their main goal is just going to be to keep out of reach so the big dragon doesn't rip them in half. I also think to supplement this, there's a good chance that both sides would be deploying scouts with some kind of signal lights or signal fires, so they could really keep track over miles and miles of territory where the other dragons are and what they're up to. Just using, simple coded signals that travel along the chain, flashing lanterns at each other or whatever, so that people back at the castle will know, oh, the dragon's over that way, this other dragon's over that way, and they know in more or less real time what's going on. They'll have better situational awareness rather than flying across the ocean to a city and going, oh, there's a dragon here, I'm so surprised. They would have systems in place to deal with this kind of thing. So what about protecting cities and castles? Well, having seen how dragons fight each other, we see that altitude and size are two big things that give a dragon an advantage. If your dragon is sleeping in a cave and an enemy dragon comes over the horizon, you're not going to get your dragon out of the cave and in the air before the enemy dragon reaches your castle and cooks whoever's in there. It's just not going to happen. Instead, you're going to want protection. You're going to have a combat air patrol constantly up, constantly circling, constantly keeping an eye out on that horizon, and constantly keeping that altitude so they can strike at other dragons who come too close. And your patrol might not be enough to stop an incoming dragon, but at least it will be enough to give you time, warning, to evacuate your castle. We see none of this in House of the Dragon. No real tactics. When Silverwing flies over King's Landing, it could have flown to the Red Keep and cooked everyone in there long before Aemond reached Vermithor. And I don't know that those ballistas were doing much good. It looked like they couldn't really move fast enough or target it, so we'll see how that plays out. On the other side, we often see dragons in the skies around Dragonstone. Sometimes it looks like they're training, sometimes it looks like they're playing, sometimes it looks like they're patrolling. It's unclear, but logically, they would have to keep a dragon in the air at all times in case Vermithor came knocking at the castle door. Without that kind of overwatch, Aemond could just fly up and end the whole series in less than 5 minutes. That's the problem with castles in this series. It tells the enemy where to find you, and it offers zero protection against a dragon. The alternative is not that interesting from a TV show or movie perspective. It'd probably be underground bunkers or secret places to sequester away the leaders. That's not sexy. That's not what science fiction and fantasy audiences expect. So I guess, from the perspective of cinematography, castles are better. In practical terms, when you're not fighting dragons, a castle is a much better way of protecting a city and maintaining power. So it kind of makes sense, but it still seems like a cookout waiting to happen. So we've beaten war to death. What about other impacts dragons have on society? Consider dragons and small folk. People would love dragons. They would be fascinated by them. They would be terrified of them. And they would almost certainly worship them. In House of the Dragon, they refer to the dragons as living gods, and given we don't see any other fantastical creatures, this is likely how they would be perceived. They live longer than people, they're bigger and more powerful than anything people can build, they breathe fire, they're intelligent, they can make their own choices. People absolutely would deify them. And people are just fascinated with exotic and large animals to begin with, And since dragons are by far the largest and most exotic creature that exists in this world, people would think about dragons all the time. So it seems like the dragon riders would spend a significant amount of their time going from city to city, showing people the dragons, just showing them off. They would attend festivals. They would attend religious events. They would favor the small folk of some distant burg that hasn't seen a dragon in close to a generation, and the people who live up there would be telling stories about that time they saw a dragon. Maybe they would even let them touch it. But the point is, the dragon riders would be doing near constant PR visits to rally the people and maintain support for the royal family, inspiring the small folk. And more cynically, if this is something done more to inspire fear and subjugate people, the dragon riders would routinely engage in shows of force, demonstrating to the people what dragonfire can do, as well as how physically powerful dragons are. These visits would be unannounced, sudden, shocking, and destructive, a powerful reminder to the small folk of their place in the world and the power their rulers have over them. But they don't really play with this much in the show. And that leads us to dragon worship. Of course there would be dragon worship. The dragons are practically immortal from a human perspective, incredibly powerful, magical. It seems likely that people would worship dragons, not a bunch of old trees. So why aren't the dragons the foundation of religion in Westeros? This feels like a miss. Even if they weren't central to the main religion, surely there would be cults all over the place worshiping dragons. Some loyal to one dragon, some loyal to another one, interpreting the dragon's behaviors and movements and cries as some kind of signs or portents. Surely there would be people who believe that the most sacred act is to be eaten by a dragon, a cult whose members offer themselves up to be eaten, to become part of something bigger than themselves. Think about it. That's how cults work. And individual dragon riders would have their own cults, people who worship them as demigods, or see them as the voices and hands of the divine, whose will is the same as the will of the gods. Depending on how writers interacted with these cults, the writers could actively participate in leading or manipulating these cults. So what do we see in the show? Well, all we see is the one cult that work in the dragon caves. I mean, that's good. It tracks that such a cult would exist, but it seems this kind of veneration and worship would be more widespread. What about other nations? What about foreign affairs? Dragons can travel relatively quickly, and they're terrifying and powerful. If only one nation has dragons, Westeros, it seems they would use dragons to control relationships with neighboring realms, keeping the peace and likely demanding fealty and tribute from nearby nations. But we don't see this. The other nations seem to treat them as equals or even look down on them a little bit. That just does not track. If one nation in the world had a weapon of mass destruction and the other ones didn't, that nation becomes the only superpower. It's going to use that. It's going to use that for economic, political, and military gain. In House of the Dragons, we don't see any evidence for this kind of leverage or manipulation. The trade, the alliances, the political relationships are far too tame, too mundane. I see this as a major miss. If Westeros alone has dragons and its neighbors do not, there's a vast power imbalance that the Iron Throne would surely exploit. Westeros would be the wealthiest and most powerful nation on the planet, and the other nations would be doing everything they could to get dragons of their own. Plots and schemes to steal eggs, efforts to marry or gain the favor of dragon riders, all manner of shenanigans. We don't see any of this in the show. I don't think any of this is in the book. It's weird. It's a weird oversight. And just a few other random thoughts to throw out there. Exploration. Dragons can fly around the world exploring every corner, bringing back news and stories and wonders from all around the globe. Why don't we see this? You'd think at least one dragon rider would be a lifetime wanderer who just travels. Theft and conspiracy. How much effort and how many resources would different groups put into stealing dragon eggs? A lot, I bet. But we kind of see these dragon eggs sort of like laying around unguarded. People stumble on them multiple times in the series. It's kind of weird. They would know every time a dragon lays a clutch. They would secure and keep track of every single egg, and those dragon caves would be more heavily defended than the Red Keep. They're going to make sure nobody gets in and out of them without them knowing about it and controlling it. And how effective these schemes would be probably depends on whether other people could even hatch the dragon eggs and whether or not they would have any ability to bond with the dragons. But even if they couldn't, even if it's purely controlled by the House of the Dragon's bloodline, the Targaryen Targaryen bloodline. Even if that were the case, a lot of people would still try, because when people are hopeless, they're going to try anything. What about wild dragons? If there were wild dragons, it seems wherever their natural habitat is would be a place humans avoided, especially if the wild version could not be or would not bond with humans. Presumably, any humans entering this area would be at great risk of being eaten or burned by the dragons, and this area would remain wild and mysterious for a very long time. So all these things they could have done with dragons, and so many missed opportunities, so many illogical elements about the dragons in this world, so much more they could have done. So why did House of the Dragons mess up dragons so badly? Well, I don't think they did, actually. Here's the thing. George is a hardcore gamer, and he has a ton of historical knowledge. So I'm pretty confident he's already thought through these kind of things, worked it out, and decided what he wanted to do and what he did not want to do, and then proceeded with deliberation and purpose when he wrote the books. So these oversights were choices, not accidents. And although many of the missing aspects of dragons would be interesting to explore and certainly would be true in a world dominated by dragons, these elements don't necessarily make for good storytelling. Some of them would be difficult to portray. Some would throw off readers accustomed to more traditional epic fantasy. So they had to make choices here. I think George and the show's writers worked hard to strike a balance between what would be interesting and exciting versus what might be confusing, boring, or distracting. And they set their focus more on storytelling and less on realism and the laws of unintended consequences. It looks like a lot of thought went into this, and then they scaled it back to something they thought would resonate more with the audience. So I wouldn't say they messed up at all. I think they did a good job, purposefully and deliberately choosing what elements to include, what to focus on, and what parts to put back in the box. I appreciate the work they put into it, and I greatly enjoy the show. But should I ever write a novel with dragons? Which is not too likely, but it could happen. I'm going to dive a little deeper into some of these other aspects of it and explore how they affect a culture and the people who live within it. I could go on and on about this. Instead, why don't you check out this next video?